I originally became interested in Ford two-cylinder autos during the 2006 early Ford registry tour in Decorah. We had a couple of two-cylinder cars on the tour. They ran well, carrying their passengers up and down the steep hills of northeast Iowa with no problem. Don Tyler had his 1904 Model C, and Wayne Kaufman had his 1905 Model F. They carried several passengers during the tour without a hiccup. They were able to keep up with the rest of the cars without problems. Since the Model F Ford is more powerful, I decided I wanted a Model F. However, Model F cars don't come up for sale often, so I decided I would see if I could find enough parts to assemble one. Tim Morsher from Ohio learned that I was looking for a two-cylinder Ford. He was disposing of Larry Porter's extra parts. I'd purchased some of these parts and made an arrangement with Tim to purchase raw castings that I could use to reconstruct the car. Without Tim's help, it would have been extremely difficult to do this project. As luck would have it, a friend of mine purchased a Model F engine. After making a couple of generous offers to buy the engine, my friend finally accepted my last offer. I purchased the engine in December of 2006 with the idea to reconstruct the Model F. The engine came from a car sold by Ford on June 23, 1905 to Sterling Motor Car Company in Binghamton, New York. Over 100 years later, on May 23, 2006, the owner at that time was from Phoenix, New York, about 90 miles from where the car was originally sold. All that was left at that time was the engine with motor number F2978. Bev and I picked up the engine in Detroit in December 2006. We went on to Ohio and picked up hundreds of pounds of raw castings, including a pair of angle irons, to build the frame. Roger Byrne from Racine, Minnesota is an expert on old rare cars as well as trucks and steam engines. His contributions of advice about every aspect of this project were invaluable. Roger and I disassembled the engine and inspected the parts. Overall, the engine was in very good shape, with no cracked jugs or extreme wear. Don Tyler, a master machinist from Ohio, rebuilt the engine. He had special aluminum pistons built for the project. He built a new camshaft and gears. New valves and guides were installed. He redesigned the main bearings and added crankshaft seals. Lubrication for the two-cylinder engine is called a total loss system. It means oil is dripped into the engine and the excess oil leaks out of the crankcase. A tank holding fresh oil is pressurized with crankcase pressure. Oil goes through 6 metering valves and is distributed to the bearings and cylinders through brass tubing. A driver must be very careful to have oil valves adjusted properly and not to run out of oil when driving. The transmission of a Model F Ford is mounted on the crankshaft. It was completely missing when I purchased the engine. In fact, even though the engine started its life as a Model F Auto, I believe the engine was used as a stationary engine application during its later years with no transmission attached. Building the transmission was a daunting task since no patterns are available for the cast iron drums and plates. Tim Morsher knew that several of us Model F folks needed transmission parts. He made contact with George Christophe, a 90-year-old man who grew up in Detroit when early cars were being built. George has built many parts for early Fords that were impossible to find. He made most of the transmission for my project. Don Tyler machined the triple gear case and finished the project. I spent quite a bit of time researching who could build the radiator. It looked like no radiator manufacturer was interested, even though several people needed radiators. Finally, Tim Morsher made the circular discs and built my radiator. He built 3 others, including one for himself. Tim Morsher knew Mel, a retired GM engineer, whose hobby is furniture building. He built the base of the body from plans we got from Ford. Mel said it was challenging because there were very few right angles in the body. A friend of mine in Tasmania, Francis Rainsley, built a Model F from a pile of parts. He had a set of rough drawings for body parts. He donated the set of plans to the early Ford registry, so I used them to build my seats. Lowell Van Horn, a master wood builder who worked with me on projects before, was interested in building the seats and doors. He designed and built the jig to form the seats. He used a laminated glue-up to form the backs of the seats. A grapevine molding was glued and nailed in place to finish. He spent most of 2008 winter working on the body. In parallel with all this work, a chassis was being built. We had to confirm the location and hole sizes for the frame rails. Many Model F owners were contacted to verify data. The chassis was built and assembled. The front axle was not too hard except for the spindles. We had to take them out to a local shop as our lathe was not large enough. The other major problem was the steering gears. We got a rough casting of the sector gear and mounting bracket, but we did not get any pitman gear. We finally found a shop in Waukon that made a pitman gear and machined the other parts. The machinist told me that the gear pitch had not been used since 1910, as he last found it listed in a 1910 book. After getting the front wheels on the ground, we got the engine installed and ready to test run. Note the rear of the chassis sitting on the table. The differential was not easy because many castings were not available. We took the insides from a Model T Diffie and machined them to fit inside the clamshell case. The original only had 2 pinions, and now we have 3, so it's much stronger than the original. The rear hubs were made from Model T hubs. Since this car is going to be a driver, we thought tapered axles would be better than the old straight axles. The radiator mounting and plumbing was tricky, but after spending many hours, it all came together. We have a beautiful water pump. The first try at coolant seals was miserable, but we think we've got it right now. The fuel tank and coolant tank had small leaks when they came from the plumber. They were not usual construction, and I think we've got them solid now. We got an old school bunch seat to use as a test bench. Several more engine run tests, and then we were ready to take it for a test drive. Roger, Cole, and I took turns until we got dizzy. We made many adjustments to the carburetor and timing. It was easy to learn how to drive the chassis. The seats had been taken to Tim's Upholstery in Forest Lake, Minnesota. Tim built the cushions with springs, webbing, and horsehair. The covering was automotive-grade leather he formed in a diamond pattern. Tim had to create the pattern since we had none. He has created patterns before, so he knew how to proceed. Tim worked on the seats for about 3 months. He then delivered the completed seats to the shop. We were now ready to paint the body. The wood body parts had been sealed by painting them with quick poly. They were now primed with epoxy primer. After sanding and filling, they were painted with acrylic enamel, a forest green color. The seats were married to the base and mounted on the chassis. The running boards and fenders were built. Jeff Fries helped attach the running board covering. Brass trim was installed. Glenn Rand had a set of patterns for the fenders, so he built the roll edge fenders with embedded wire. He shipped them to us flat. Roger and I formed them in the shop with the aid of an 8-inch piece of water pipe. Luckily, we had an assembly drawing of the hood. It provided a good guideline to form the sheet metal. A wood form was made with the dimensions we thought the hood should be. The hood has 22 louvers on the side. We experimented with a homemade louver die and were able to make repeatable louvers. After research on the internet, it was decided to build a C-throat press. A 30-ton puck was purchased to use with our porta-power. The press turned out nice, and we made sample of 11 louvers in a test piece of scrap metal. The louvers were formed on the hood without a hitch. The brass edge trim on the hood was made from 5/16-inch brass tubing. It was annealed and then formed. After slitting, it was silver soldered in place. 2 flat brass trim pieces were needed for the top of the hood. We found a brass door kick plate was the right size to make the two pieces. The dogleg top was a real challenge. We worked more than 6 months on it. We had absolutely no patterns. Cardboard templates were made, and then a set of prototype bows were made and installed with steel bend-ups. The prototype wood was a Masonite OSB glue-up. The final bows were oak strips laminated with tight bond cement. Lowell made the form to the size of the prototype bows. Unfortunately, the bows were too flexible and the form wasn't quite correct. After a bow was made and fitted, it was necessary to rebuild the form so the resultant bow would fit the attach points better. The bows are attached to the body with brass mounting brackets. We spent hours researching the best method to build the brackets. Brass castings were available, but they were not long enough. Francis Rainsley from Tasmania came to our aid again with information about how he built his attachments. We used 1" by 3/8 inch brass bar stock. It was annealed and formed in our press. The rear attachment has a 90-degree bend at the lower end. This was accomplished by heating the brass and bending it while hot. It was a difficult process. We had to mill off the edges of the brass on the part that attaches to the wood. It was then hand filed to make the desired silhouette. Polish was achieved by using gradually finer increments of sandpaper and then a buffing wheel with jeweler's rouge. The Hartscloth fabric was installed by Tim the upholsterer in our shop. We added leather straps in front and rear to make sure the top doesn't fly off the car while driving. We wanted 500 miles on the car before any major tour. It has run well with no surprises after we learned how to shift it properly. Would we do it again? You betcha.